Pablo Escobar spent $2,500 every single month just on rubber bands. Not on cars, not on houses, not on women, on rubber bands. Because he had so much cash pouring in every single day that he needed thousands of rubber bands just to wrap the bills into stacks. His accountants estimated that they lost nearly 10% of their annual revenue to rats and water damage because they literally could not count the money fast enough. They were burying it in fields. They were hiding it inside walls. They were stuffing it into warehouses. One time his daughter got sick and Pablo burned $2 million in cash just to keep her warm because they were hiding in the mountains and had no firewood. $2 million turned to ash just to keep a little girl from freezing. That is the level of money we are talking about. And that money funded a lifestyle so extravagant, so outrageous, so completely insane that it makes every modern billionaire look like they are living in a studio apartment. Today we are going deep into the world of Pablo Escobar. Not just the wars, not just the politics. We are talking about how he lived, how he spent, how he smuggled, and how he built the most profitable criminal business the world has ever seen. This is the complete story of Pablo Escobar's lifestyle, his business empire, his smuggling operations, and the gang wars that made him the most feared man on earth. And I promise you some of these details will blow your mind. Let us start with the money because everything in Pablo's world began and ended with money. At the peak of his power in the late 1980s, Pablo Escobar was earning an estimated $420 million per week. Let me say that again. $420 million every single week. That is $60 million a day, $2.5 million an hour, $40,000 a minute. Every minute of every hour of everyday money was flowing into Pablo's operation at a rate that the human brain cannot fully comprehend. Forbes magazine listed Pablo Escobar as the seventh richest man in the world in 1989. His estimated net worth was $30 billion. That put him ahead of most of the world's legitimate billionaires. He was richer than the GDP of most countries. He had more cash than some central banks. And almost all of it came from one product: cocaine. But having that much money created problems that most people never think about. Pablo couldn't put his money in banks. He couldn't invest it through normal channels. He couldn't declare it on tax returns. He had billions of dollars in physical cash and nowhere to put it. So he got creative. Pablo built warehouses specifically designed to store cash. These weren't small rooms. These were massive industrial buildings filled floor to ceiling with stacks of $100 bills. His accountants would spend weeks counting the money, and by the time they finished, new shipments of cash had already arrived. They were always behind. They could never keep up. Pablo buried money underground in fields and properties across Colombia. He hid cash inside the walls of his houses. He stuffed it into furniture. He stored it in secret compartments in his cars. Years after his death, people were still finding hidden caches of money and properties that had belonged to him. In 2015, one of his former associates revealed a hidden compartment in a house that contained $18 million in cash that had been sitting there for over 20 years. And then there were the losses. Pablo estimated that he wrote off nearly 10% of his total revenue every year due to damage and loss. Rats literally ate his money. Water destroyed stacks of bills stored in damp locations. Some money was simply lost because there was so much of it that nobody could keep track. 10% of his annual revenue was billions of dollars. He was losing more money to rats than most people will earn in 1,000 lifetimes. Now let us talk about how Pablo spent that money because his lifestyle was beyond anything you can imagine. Pablo's primary residence was a massive estate called Hacienda Napoles. It was located about 3 hours east of Medellin in the Magdalena River Valley. The property covered approximately 7,700 acres. That is larger than many small towns. The entrance to Hacienda Napoles featured a gate with a small Piper PA-18 aircraft mounted on top. This was the actual plane that Pablo used for his very first cocaine smuggling run. He kept it as a trophy, as a reminder of where it all started. Inside the estate, Pablo built a complete private zoo. This was not a few animals in cages. This was a full-scale zoological park with animals imported from around the world. He had elephants, giraffes, ostriches, exotic birds, rhinoceroses, and most famously 4 hippos. Those 4 hippos have since multiplied, and there are now over 150 feral hippos living in Colombia's waterways. They are considered an invasive species and an ecological disaster. Pablo's hippos are still causing problems 30 years after his death. The estate had multiple swimming pools, a helicopter pad, a go-kart track, a bull ring for private bullfights, a network of artificial lakes stocked with exotic fish, and a fleet of vintage cars, including a Porsche, a collection of Rolls-Royces, and several classic American automobiles. There was a full-size soccer field because Pablo was obsessed with soccer. He funded local teams and even built illuminated pitches in poor neighborhoods across Medellin. The main house at Hacienda Nápoles was a sprawling mansion decorated with expensive art sculptures and furniture imported from Europe. Every room was designed for luxury. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, gold fixtures, the works. Pablo entertained guests, constantly hosting parties that lasted for days, with unlimited food, alcohol, music, and women. But Hacienda Nápoles was just one of Pablo's properties. He owned dozens of homes and apartments across Colombia. He had properties in Medellin, Bogotá, Cartagena, and several other cities. He owned beach houses on the Caribbean coast. He had ranches in the countryside. He had apartments in residential towers. At one point, he was estimated to own over 800 properties across Colombia. Each one was stocked with cash, weapons, and supplies in case he needed to flee at a moment's notice. Pablo also owned a private island in the Caribbean. He bought a fleet of helicopters and private jets. He had speedboats and yachts. He collected luxury cars the way other people collect stamps. His garage reportedly contained over 100 vehicles at various times, including multiple Porsche 911s, Mercedes-Benz, BMWs, Toyota Land Cruisers for security purposes, and armored vehicles for protection. His personal wardrobe was surprisingly understated for a man of his wealth. Pablo preferred casual clothing, jeans, polo shirts, and sneakers. He didn't wear flashy jewelry or designer suits like some other drug lords. But don't let that fool you. His watches alone were worth millions. He owned multiple Rolex watches, custom pieces from luxury Swiss brands, and jewelry that he kept in safes across his properties. Pablo's family lived in similar luxury. His wife Maria Victoria and now wore designer clothes and expensive jewelry. His children Juan Pablo and Manuela attended the best private schools. They had private tutors, bodyguards, and drivers. They traveled in armored vehicles surrounded by security teams. Even their birthday parties were legendary events with hundreds of guests, live entertainment, and gifts that would make a Hollywood celebrity jealous. But Pablo didn't just spend money on himself. He spent it strategically to build loyalty and political power. He invested heavily in what he called civic projects. He built entire neighborhoods for the poor in Medellin. The most famous was Barrio Pablo Escobar, a housing development that provided free homes to families living in the slums. He built soccer fields, schools, and community centers. He distributed cash directly to people in poor neighborhoods. He funded medical clinics and food programs. To the poor of Medellin, Pablo Escobar wasn't a drug lord. He was a savior. They called him El Patron, the boss, or El Papa de los Pobres, the father of the poor. They loved him. They protected him. They would die for him, and many of them did. This Robin Hood image was carefully cultivated by Pablo. He understood that the loyalty of the poor was his greatest shield against the government. As long as the people of Medellin's slums supported him, law enforcement would have a nearly impossible time finding him. Every raid would be met with resistance. Every informant would be identified and dealt with. The community itself became Pablo's security system. Now let us talk about the business side, because Pablo Escobar didn't just stumble into becoming the world's biggest drug lord. He built a supply chain that was more sophisticated than most legitimate multinational corporations. Pablo's cocaine operation started at the source. Coca leaves were grown primarily in Peru and Bolivia, where the climate and altitude were perfect for coca cultivation. Pablo established relationships with coca farmers and paste producers in both countries. He sent agents to negotiate prices, arrange purchases, and oversee quality control. He paid premium prices for high-quality coca paste, ensuring that his suppliers remained loyal. The raw coca paste was then transported to Colombia, where Pablo had established a network of processing laboratories hidden deep in the jungle. These labs were staffed by chemists who refined the coca paste into pure cocaine hydrochloride. The labs were sophisticated operations with generators, water purification systems, chemical storage facilities, and living quarters for the workers. Some of these labs could process several tons of cocaine per month. Security around the labs was intense. Pablo stationed armed guards around the perimeter. He set up early warning systems to detect approaching military patrols. He built the labs in remote locations that were difficult to access by road, making helicopter raids the only viable method of attack. And even when labs were discovered and destroyed, Pablo would simply build new ones. He had the money and the manpower to replace any facility within weeks. Once the cocaine was processed, it needed to be transported to the United States, which was by far the largest market. This is where Pablo's genius for smuggling truly shone. He didn't rely on a single method. He used every possible route and technique to move cocaine across international borders. His most famous method was aerial smuggling. Pablo operated a fleet of small aircraft, including Cessna's Pipers and other light planes that could carry hundreds of kilos of cocaine per trip. These planes would fly from Colombia to remote airstrips in Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean islands, and even directly into the United States. The pilots would fly at low altitude to avoid radar detection, often at night, using only minimal instruments. Some flights would drop their cargo into the ocean near predetermined coordinates where speedboats would pick it up. Others would land on hidden airstrips cut into the jungle or on deserted roads in rural areas. At the peak of his operation, Pablo had so many planes in service that he reportedly bought a Learjet just for the purpose of transporting cash back to Colombia. He had more aircraft than many small airlines, and the planes were expendable. If one was seized or crashed, he simply bought another. The total value of the cocaine on each flight far exceeded the cost of the aircraft. Pablo also used maritime smuggling extensively. He employed fishing boats, cargo ships, and custom-built speedboats to move cocaine by sea. Some of his most innovative methods involved hiding cocaine inside shipments of legitimate goods. Cocaine was concealed inside hollowed-out lumber, inside canned goods, inside frozen fish shipments, inside industrial machinery, and even inside concrete fence posts. One of his most audacious methods involved building semi-submersible vessels, essentially homemade submarines, that could carry several tons of cocaine across the Caribbean. These vessels rode just below the surface of the water, making them nearly impossible to detect by radar or visual patrol. They were crude and dangerous, but they were effective, and they could carry enormous quantities of cocaine in a single trip. Pablo also used human couriers known as mules to carry cocaine across borders. These couriers would swallow small packages of cocaine wrapped in latex or hide them in luggage, clothing, or specially designed body harnesses. Some couriers carried cocaine in hollowed-out shoes and false-bottom suitcases or in specially modified clothing with hidden compartments. While each individual courier carried only a few kilos, the sheer number of couriers Pablo employed meant that significant quantities were moving through airports and border crossings every single day. But perhaps Pablo's most brilliant smuggling innovation was his use of legitimate businesses as fronts for cocaine transportation. He owned import-export companies that shipped flowers, fruits, and other goods from Colombia to the United States and Europe. Cocaine was hidden among these legitimate shipments, making detection extremely difficult. Customs agents couldn't inspect every box of flowers or every crate of fruit. And Pablo's companies had all the proper documentation and permits, making them appear completely legitimate. The distribution network in the United States was equally sophisticated. Pablo established connections with distributors in every major American city. Miami was his primary entry point and distribution hub. From Miami, cocaine was shipped to New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, and dozens of other cities. Pablo worked with Dominican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, and African American distribution networks to move cocaine at the street level. He also supplied Mexican traffickers who distributed cocaine in the western United States. These Mexican connections would later grow into the massive cartels that dominate the drug trade today. Pablo's pricing strategy was simple but effective. He flooded the market with high-quality cocaine at prices that undercut all competition. In the early 1980s, a kilo of cocaine sold for approximately $60,000 in the United States. Pablo's production costs were a fraction of that. Even after paying for transportation, security bribes, and distribution, his profit margins were enormous. And by keeping prices relatively low, he ensured that demand remained strong and that competitors couldn't match his product. Now let us talk about the gang wars, because Pablo Escobar didn't build his empire peacefully. From the very beginning, violence was his primary tool for resolving disputes, eliminating competition, and maintaining control. Pablo's first major gang war was against the DS agent who tried to expose him. In the late 1970s, a DEAS agent raided one of Pablo's early cocaine shipments and arrested several of his associates. Pablo didn't file a complaint or hire a lawyer. He had the agent killed. That set the pattern for everything that followed. If someone threatened Pablo's business, they died. In the early 1980s, as Pablo was consolidating his control over the Medellin cocaine trade, he went to war with several rival trafficking organizations. The most significant was his conflict with Griselda Blanco, the godmother of cocaine, who controlled cocaine distribution in Miami. Griselda was as ruthless as Pablo, and their rivalry contributed to the Miami drug wars of the early 1980s, which saw hundreds of murders in the city and turned Miami into one of the most dangerous places in America. Pablo eventually won that conflict through a combination of superior supply, overwhelming violence, and strategic alliances. Within the Medellin cartel itself, Pablo maintained control through a combination of generous payment and absolute terror. His famous philosophy was plata o plomo, silver or lead. Accept my bribe or accept my bullet. There was no third option. This approach was applied to everyone from street-level dealers to judges to presidents. If you worked with Pablo, you got rich. If you worked against him, you got dead. Pablo's sicarios were legendary. He recruited young men from the poorest neighborhoods of Medellin's comunas, the hillside slums that overlooked the city. These kids had nothing. No education, no jobs, no future. Pablo gave them money, status, weapons, and a sense of belonging. In return, they gave him absolute loyalty and a willingness to kill without hesitation. The most notorious of Pablo's sicarios was a young man named Juan Jairo Velasquez, known as Popeye. Popeye personally admitted to committing over 300 murders and ordering the deaths of 3,000 more on Pablo's behalf. He was Pablo's chief assassin and one of his most trusted associates. Popeye later served 23 years in prison and became a YouTube celebrity in Colombia before his death in 2020. Another key sicario was Dandanay Muñoz Mosquera, known as La Kika. La Kika was responsible for some of the most devastating attacks carried out by the Medellin cartel, including the bombing of Avianca Flight 203. He was eventually captured and extradited to the United States, where he was convicted and sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences plus 45 years. Pablo also employed a network of teenage assassins known as sicarios de moto. These kids would ride on the back of motorcycles while another kid drove. They would pull up alongside a target, shoot them at point-blank range, and disappear into traffic before anyone could react. This method of assassination became so common in Medellin that it earned its own name. They called it the Medellin style. It was cheap, fast, efficient, and nearly impossible to prevent. Pablo's gang wars extended beyond rival traffickers. He went to war with the Colombian government multiple times, as we discussed in our previous documentary. But he also fought internal battles within the Medellin cartel itself. When associates became too powerful, too independent, or too unreliable, Pablo eliminated them. He killed partners who he suspected of skimming money. He killed associates who he feared might become informants. He killed people who simply annoyed him. Nobody was safe, not even his closest friends. One of the most significant internal conflicts was Pablo's falling out with the Moncada and Galeano families. Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Moncada were wealthy traffickers who operated under Pablo's umbrella within the Medellin cartel. They were loyal associates who had worked with Pablo for years. But in 1992, while Pablo was living in his luxury prison La Catedral, he became convinced that Galeano and Moncada were hiding money from him and not paying their fair share of tribute. Pablo summoned both men to La Catedral for a meeting. What happened next varies depending on who tells the story, but the result is undisputed. Both Galeano and Moncada were killed inside La Catedral. Their bodies were reportedly dismembered and removed from the prison. The murders of Galeano and Moncada had catastrophic consequences for Pablo. Their families and associates were outraged. Many of them defected from the Medellin cartel and joined Los Peeps, the vigilante death squad funded by the Cali cartel. The intelligence they provided about Pablo's operations, safe houses, and associates was invaluable to the search block and contributed directly to Pablo's eventual downfall. The war between the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel was perhaps the most significant gang war in the history of the drug trade. These two organizations controlled the vast majority of the world's cocaine supply, and their conflict shaped the course of Colombian history. The Cali cartel, led by the Rodriguez-Orihuela brothers, fought Pablo not with bombs and assassinations, but with corruption and intelligence. They infiltrated the Colombian government at the highest levels. They paid for information about Pablo's movements and operations. They funded Los Peeps to systematically dismantle Pablo's support network. And they waited patiently for Pablo to destroy himself through his own recklessness. The Cali cartel's approach proved more effective in the long run. While Pablo was spending his fortune on bombs and sicarios, the Cali brothers were investing their money in legitimate businesses, real estate, and political connections. While Pablo was making enemies of every government institution in Colombia, the Cali brothers were making friends with them. While Pablo was becoming the most wanted man in the world, the Cali brothers were operating in relative obscurity. In the end, the Cali cartel's patience paid off. Pablo was killed while the Cali cartel was at the height of its power. They had essentially used the Colombian government and the United States as weapons against their rival. It was a masterclass in strategic gang warfare. But let me tell you about one more aspect of Pablo's lifestyle that most people don't know about: his personal life. Despite being one of the most feared men on earth, Pablo Escobar was by all accounts a devoted family man. He married Maria Victoria, and now, when she was just 15 years old and he was 26, they remained married until his death. He adored his children Juan Pablo and Manuela, and by all accounts spent as much time with them as his criminal life allowed. He read them bedtime stories. He helped them with homework. He took them on vacations. He spoiled them with gifts and experiences that most children could never dream of. For Manuela's birthday, he once imported an entire circus complete with elephants and acrobats. For Juan Pablo, he bought motorcycles, cars, and the latest electronic gadgets. But Pablo was also a notorious womanizer. He had affairs with journalists, beauty queens, television personalities, and countless other women throughout his life. He kept multiple mistresses in apartments across Medellin and Bogotá. One of his most famous affairs was with Virginia Vallejo, a prominent Colombian television journalist, who later wrote a tell-all book about their relationship. Despite his infidelities, Pablo was fiercely protective of his family. Anyone who threatened Maria Victoria or his children faced immediate and extreme consequences. When his family was on the run during the final months of his life, Pablo became increasingly desperate to protect them. Some analysts believe that his obsession with keeping his family safe was ultimately what got him killed. The phone call to his son on December 2, 1993, the call that allowed the search block to pinpoint his location, was made because Pablo wanted to check on his family. He died because he loved his children too much to stop calling them. That is the complete picture of Pablo Escobar, a man who earned more money than he could count, who lived a lifestyle of unimaginable luxury, who built a smuggling operation more sophisticated than most Fortune 500 companies, who waged wars against government's rival cartels and even his own associates, and who in the end was brought down by a phone call to his son. His legacy lives on in ways both visible and invisible. The hippos at Hacienda Napoles still roam the Colombian countryside. The neighborhoods he built still stand. The cartels he inspired still operate. The drug trade he industrialized still flourishes. And somewhere in Colombia, people still whisper the name El Patron with a mixture of fear, respect, and something that almost looks like love. Pablo Escobar was a monster. But he was a monster who understood something fundamental about the world. Money is power. Fear is control. And in a system that offers nothing to the poor, the man who gives them something becomes their god, even if that something is paid for in blood. Subscribe for more stories about the hidden forces that shape our world. Real stories told unfiltered, because the truth behind the legend is always more fascinating than the myth. See you soon.